roadblock 1 through 5 are share out, and our strategies share out, and our checklist.
All right. I have roadblock 1, and roadblock 1 talks about a teacher talking to students through grades 3 through 8, and they were talking about the reading assignments that they get in their textbooks. And the teacher asked the students if they read their assigned works, like at home or in after school, and a lot of them answered no, they didn't have to. Or if you listen in class, the teacher goes over each chapter. And one student even said that all you have to do is look up the vocabulary words and only read the parts that you need to answer the questions. So that's putting in a concept of students only learning to pass the class by listening and just taking notes and copying notes from the teachers. And some students even said that they never read their assigned readings because the teacher never asks about it afterwards or connects it to their learning assignments. And roadblock 2 was talking about difficult readers, and it talks about if students find reading very difficult, their main choice is just to not read. It also mentioned in here that educators need to find more, I guess, better ways, more interactive ways to build comprehension strategies, I guess fun and interactive ways. And even there's a quote in here, it mentions that a quality teacher plays a critical factor in effective instruction. So it also mentioned that students who can't read heavily rely on oral presentations, and that oral presentations may not always be available to students, so it's important that they figure out how to read. And the older students get, their self-esteem lowers when they feel discouraged by not being able to read like their peers.
Well, and this really is where lots of behavior starts, because to deflect from not being able to do the reading or not having done the reading, then that's where behavior starts acting.
And in the end of roadblock 2, it mentions that a lot of problems in like the middle schools is that some teachers don't have the background knowledge to teach the reading content because it wasn't a part of their pre-service training.
And they think by the time the kids get to them that they should know how to read, and so then they get bogged down with trying to figure out how to teach when these kids can't read, and they blame elementary school.
Yes,
And then
I agree with you on where you said the behavior, because
does.
they will act out, and that will throw them focusing on them acting
Right.
out instead of focusing on
does.
them not doing their.
And sometimes I don't think they're doing it for that matter. They're just feeling like a failure, and
They're
it's-
feeling discouraged.
And, and if you look at this type
They don't
of
wanna be
text,
embarrassed.
it's hard to read. I mean, if you don't have a good reading foundation, then you get into the science books, the social studies books. I mean, there's big words in there, and and it's assuming that you've had a real, it just jumps right into that hard reading, and they're not prepared for it. All right, Miss Brewster and I have roadblock 3, the myth of learning to read versus learning to read. And this goes right back to what I was just saying. It's very hard for the content teachers, especially middle school and high school, to teach the content because they're having to water it down so that the kids understand it, because they cannot pick up one of these textbooks and read it and understand what they're reading. And one of the things I highlighted in here is like one of the myths about this is that too many teachers believe that in the lower grades, students are too busy learning to read. Once in the middle school, they must be prepared to read to learn. So I think middle school kind of looks at elementary like, hey, you need to teach them to read because the real work's when they get to us. And that is definitely not the case, because if you take somebody that is learning to read or has reading difficulties, that is a very hard job. By the end of 3rd grade, classroom priorities flip. And, when kids do get to 3rd grade, it is a different focus. They stop learning how to read and begin needing to read. Obviously, the time to abandon this idea and teach students how to read to learn is in all, and we do need to read in all subjects. In the last few years, we're spending so much time on the reading and the math that really we're skipping social studies and science and health and that's where they're getting that type of hard reading that they really
benefit if
It
they
would
had
benefit.
assigned a resource teacher.
Right,
that
it
could
really would.
teach
And it
that.
would have been nice if we'd been able to, just getting off topic here, but, you know, when he suggested to departmentalize our third, fourth, and fifth grade, that would have put strong people in reading, strong people in math, and then strong people in the science and the social studies that wanted to be teaching what they're teaching. And the kids would get a little dose of it on a regular basis. I mean, I think now they might have to just throw 30 minutes in somewhere wherever it fits in, 15 minutes here. And that's also saying those subjects are not important. I mean, if you know, kids are probably thinking, hey, science is not important, social studies is not important because we're doing reading and math. So that's my take on that. You know, and it is, and you with pre-K realize, you know, your kids coming into you, they could look at a book and you tell them to read, and they would look at you like you're crazy, you know, because they don't understand what that is. Well, if you take somebody with a reading difficulty or not had any prior help, they're going to look at that science or social studies. You know, you take one of these kids that's very, very low, and teacher has them open up that book, they're going to be like, you're pre-K kids. I mean, it's like, they don't, I mean, and it's sad. I mean, but that's the way that's reality. And that's why we need to try to come up with good strategies and concepts and, you know, things to teach them, you know, how to get that stuff in there. And taking notes, I read that in something. Learning to be good note takers. Oh, I already jumped on into your roadblock, really. Learning to, but you know, we need to teach kids. We need to teach people how to take notes because so many of them are heavily relying on their notes to pass the class. All right, Miss, I need to get a short
That's really about 4.
No, she threw it in there.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
I
just,
sort of did, yeah.
Yeah, it talks about the same thing.
Yeah.
the teaching the science.
All right.
Mine is roadblock 5, and it is the transmission model of learning. And I think I was in placement this semester in the chemistry room, and it's my first semester being in placement. And it probably, of all the roadblocks, this one was probably the one that I noticed first, and then ended up noticing the most. But this one is pretty much just that teachers who make their lesson plans using this model, they think that you can just lecture to get the content across, and that students should just copy notes and memorize things and like learn the vocabulary just pretty much by memorizing. But a lot of teachers, they cling to that. This roadblock says they do that because it's what they know, or like how they were taught. And even though there are changes that are trying to be made for like more interactive ways to learn, they can't just change it completely. It has to be any adjustment in the teaching practice. It needs to be like, you need to consider the teacher's beliefs, how they were taught, how they feel about learning, and also a big thing I noticed was provide ongoing support. So kind of like this book study, like I've learned a lot from you in like terms of, you know.
Right. And I like that it says that, you know, lessons need to be short and focused. And that follows lots of research. You know, we're supposed to be throwing in brain breaks every 20 to 30 minutes or whatever. And, you know, as an adult, it's hard to sit in a class. When you're taking a class, you find yourself wiggling, and so, I mean, it really makes you understand these little kids, it's hard to sit. So you do need to try to break it down and model stuff. And
she talks about that. She wants to make sure her teaching has like song and dance, so to speak, because one of her students had mentioned like, could you sing and dance to live and things?
Oh, and that was her own child that said that, yeah, because they had a guest speaker come in, and the information was interesting, but it was just dry, you know.
Interesting enough. So yeah, you have to, she says at the end, in planning a lesson, she always thinks, how can I make this lesson interactive so my students and I share responsibility for their learning? And I think that's something that I noticed in my placement was that a lot of the material that was being taught was not the way I learned it. It was a little bit more interactive, like even though it was just maybe 5 years ago when I took high school chemistry, or a little longer, 7 years ago when I took that, it still was very much memorized and like lecture style, and even now it's not the way I learned it. It doesn't make it better or worse, but it's, you know, a different learning style. So, all roadblock. So thanks for sharing your roadblocks. Now I want to share out our strategies that we're gonna model.
Miss Bragg is not here.
Yeah, we're gonna skip the see,
So-
think, wonder, and whatever order we wanna go in.
Alright. You can go right ahead. I'll go, honey. You're the youngest. We'll let you do what you want to do.
Okay. Okay, so I chose the role and retail strategy. And what I normally do, I give my kids another one where they have room to write. And whatever story we're reading that week is usually what they do it on. The week we done this, we were on a story called Carl the Complainer. And Carl complained because the park was closing too early and he couldn't stay past 5. So him and his friends, they got a petition together and they saved the park and it would now stay open till dark. But what do? Here they just roll a dice, and if you roll a 1, you write about what the story is mostly about. If you roll a 2, you just mention the main characters. If you roll a 3, you just tell where the story takes place. So for example, in Carl the Complainer, the story took place in the neighborhood park, or the kids could say outside. If you roll a 4, when does the story take place? The kids could have said during the day or the evening because they were complaining about the park closing too early in the evening. And if you roll a 5, that's kids will have to explain what happened in the beginning, middle, and the end of the story. And when you roll a 6, that's just for kids to have a discussion about the story. Is there anything that they do not understand or they want to learn more about? So that's pretty much my retail activity. My kids really seem to enjoy this. It's interactive. It gets them up moving off their feet. And I normally use the big
They
foam
love dice. Yeah, the kids
So-
love dice.
And I feel like you can use that even in, I'm trying to think for chemistry, because you read so much.
Oh yeah, you can make your
Yeah, you
questions anything you would want. And, you could apply it to anything.
I like it.
Yeah, that was
Whenever-
good.
Thank you.
That was good. Want to do your Venn diagram? Ms.
Um,
Brewster?
okay, I just went with something a little simple. You know, I do teach pre-K, and I went with apples and oranges. And I went through today and I was asking the kids some questions, and we were just talking about the differences and how they were alike. And I had one that did say that they were both round, and then another one's, because we did have apples today, so they got to see the apple, and I had brought an orange. So they did see that, no, that apple's not round, it was more ovalish. They said it was ovalish. And you can eat the skin on an apple, you can't on an orange, but they both have skin. So, and the colors, they talked about the colors of the apples and oranges. And then I put in the citrus, they didn't. And you know, with apples, you can make apple juice, and with oranges, you make orange juice. And we did have both kinds of juice for them to look at today, so. And it was a fruit, they grow on trees, they both said they were both sweet. And I asked them, where can we get them at? And they said at the grocery store, they could buy them at the grocery store. They have seeds, so I just went with
That's
something a
pretty
little
good
simple.
And you know, really, and you could do this, just change your questions up. Your
I
kids
was
can do
thinking
that.
about that when,
You know, you could just read a story, and it would be easy to do. Your kids can do it.
well, we're going into transition,
Yeah.
and I was thinking about using it maybe for kindergarten. What do you
Mhm.
think you're gonna, you know, what do you wanna know about kindergarten? What do you think you're gonna
Yeah,
learn when
that
you go
would
to
be good.
kindergarten?
That would be good. All right, mine is think aloud. And with the think aloud, it's always good when you're going over something to kind of stress your points. That's a good way to stress your points. So with my 5th grade, we are doing a comprehension lesson with Paul Revere and the American Revolution. This comes from our above level Dakota, not a really Dakota, leveled readers. And this is the first time I've had a class that's above a level, because usually I deal with people having reading problems. But you know, as we've been reading it and going over it for the past few weeks, you know, like one of the things it was talking about was the Stamp Act. So we had this big discussion, you know, when this talked about, you know, you'd go to jail if you didn't have your stamp or whatever. And, you know, I was talking about, all right, the Stamp Act, does that mean that we need to go mail this, you know? And they're, you know, No, then we talked about, why it is not that type of a thing. And we also did a talking about King George does look a little bit like George Washington. But, as you're reading, it helps bring out a point you want to make with the kids. And, and as we're reading about him, we're looking, I'm like, well, does he look like George Washington? Why does he look like George Washington? How many he ruled lots of different places.
It's a good way to connect to prior knowledge.
It's a very good way to
see
connect.
what they know about George
And
Washington.
It is.
Also, that gets their interest,
And-
and that might make them curious enough.
And
to
that
want
they
to
and this
dig a
page
little
right
deeper.
here, really, we had a big discussion on the gun itself, and how this has the knife on the end, or just whatever you want to call that. But then we were talking about how the Minutemen didn't have all the same uniforms. They had something red, and it didn't matter if it fit them or not. They still had to wear it. And, then you're like, well, would you wear something, with that, So, you can tie anything that you're doing in with a think aloud, read aloud, just simply because you want them to think. And as we've read through this, we've been reading it several pages, and today we just got to the beginning of his ride because we learned about all this stuff that he actually did. So, just, you can, like I say, you can apply it to anything you want to. Talking about the Tea Party. Well, the Boston Tea Party. People don't really even drink tea today. So, it wouldn't be the same. So, I'm like, how many people drink tea? Do you like, And they're like, half the time they don't know what you're talking about. Or they have iced tea. So, anything that you're reading or going over, you can really just stop and just think aloud and give them the time to think about it, to discuss it. It's a good way to bring your vocabulary in. Like one of the vocabulary word is glimmer. So, when you read it, you're like, now what does glimmer mean? What do you think that means? So really, that's really all think aloud is. Just thinking out loud.
And since I don't have a classroom, I chose a strategy that I think would have helped when I tutored in the past. It's something that I saw my students struggle a lot with, and that was summarizing. And I think even to this day, it's probably one that I'm not
I think it's
strong
hard.
in
I think to summarize
as
is
some of the
hard.
other ones. So I
Thank you.
made you copies. You could kind of look at it, but on the front where it says summarizing, how summarizing helps you, I would tell my students that you have to have like an understanding of the main idea and really be able to choose the supporting details to be able to summarize. So if you can remember word for word what you read, but you can't really pick out the main ideas, the most important parts, and the details for those, then I don't think that you actually know it. I think that you've memorized it. And that shows up a lot with summarizing. If they're not able to really break that down, then that'll let you know that they memorized it. They didn't exactly learn it as deeply as you would want them to. So for summarizing, all you really need is a short article or a section of a chapter and the guidelines to follow when you do that. I would teach my students to read the piece 2 to 3 times, and for my content that would be chemistry, so 11th and 12th graders. So it may be as long as the example on the back, or it may be longer, but they would still need to read it 2 to 3 times. Then to think about the main points, and then be able to list 4 to 5 main points. From there, they need to write a topic or a lead sentence that includes the title and the main idea. So the title of the article they read and the main idea of it. From there, they should reread what their main points were that they listed and put them in, if it's a story, it should be in chronological order, but if it's any other literature, logical order works for that. And then they should turn each main point into a complete sentence. And at the end, they should write a wrap-up sentence that'll tie, like a conclusion. And from there, that'll tie all their points together. And just something I wrote as a hint is a summary is a brief restatement in your own words that includes only the main points. It differs from paraphrasing because paraphrasing is an actual precise restatement that you shouldn't really leave out anything when you paraphrase, but when you summarize, you really want to only include those main points. So on the back, I have an example that you can skim through, but it's about pH, which is the measure of the concentration of H3O plus ions in an aqueous solution. So this whole paragraph, there's a lot of vocabulary that my students would probably be unfamiliar with. But they would be able, hopefully, to pick out their main points. And I listed 4 main points, because you should choose between 4 to 5. From there, I was able to create a topic sentence where I started in the article measuring pH. Again, I included that article's title in there. And then I made all of my main points into a complete sentence and wrapped it up with my conclusion. And that was how I summarized my article.
Very good job.
Thank
Yes.
you.
A lot of good points, I like that.
But you know, summarizing is kind of hard to do if you haven't been taught to do it correctly and get in like a routine of doing it.
And what's really hard is getting people to use their own words.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Right.
copy evidence out of
And then
this
that
good
becomes
text.
plagiarism if they're not careful.
See, because that's
which-
what I'm working with my students now, trying to summarize in your own words what the story was about. Do not copy, from the story word for
Well,
word.
and it's a problem we're having on like all the writing assessments. They have to read a paragraph and then write from it, and I think they're just copying what the story,
Right.
what they read instead of actually being able to put it into what they needed to be.
And that's why, like, the book that I chose, because whatever, like, the strategies that we chose out of the book, it gives you the why, the purpose, the materials, and the guidelines. And I'll be honest, I think that I struggled to do this. I tried it on my own without reading through the guidelines that it gave me, and my paragraph was not as strong, or my summary was not as strong as when I actually followed. So I think it's a pretty good book for that. But since we went through that, now I want to go through our content area reading strategy checklist. And that's just really I just want to share out how we kind of like what we do before reading, what we do during reading, and what we do after reading. And since we all have the same checklist, it's 229 there. Yeah. Since we all have the same one, I'm just going to start and share that before reading. I'm actually going to tell you the ones I don't do, since there are more that I do.
Okay.
Before reading, I usually don't ask questions.
I don't either.
I don't.
I know that I should, like, now, but that is one that I tend to leave out. And during reading, I don't continue to ask questions and look for answers, because I never ask questions in the beginning. And I also do not jot questions to ask the teacher, especially when I'm confused. I mean, right now, my classes are online, I could email. I'm thinking maybe in class, I may underline it and raise my hand at that point, but I think that one would really depend on the setting where I'm reading, but for the most part, I do not write questions down.
And I do not stop after each section and try to remember it, even though I know that's what I need to do, and even though I tell kids to do that, that's one I need to practice on during the reading.
And I think after reading, that's the one that I do the least amount of things. And on the checklist, I think a lot of times I do read because I have to, or, because I know I have to read it. And if that's the case, I don't always really wrap up at the end, like, what did I learn from this? I'll just, I'm done, I'll close the book. So after reading, I don't usually discuss ideas with a partner or group. Usually don't have anyone reading the same thing. And I don't study my notes or skim the text after the assignment. It's
And
almost like I'm
my
finished.
reading now is not really, the reading I do is really leisure reading. And I don't need to do any of
I
that
like
stuff
to
for
read.
that, but I like to read, but
When I was in college, I would take notes,
I know I'm a
On what I
note
read.
taker, yeah.
but after that, I was like, okay, I'm done. I read. I took
I'm a note
notes.
taker and a
like,
list
in my
maker, but
When I read, I feel like I make a lot of notes and a lot of lists for, like if I was doing math problems,
yeah.
I'll make side notes.
Yeah, but now
add
I
this
have,
first, but
Where
reading,
I highlighted and made notes throughout this whole thing. And I think that was one of the biggest things I had to learn when you got to college, is you could actually write in that book.
Highlighting
because-
was really helpful. It was to me.
Highlighting,
in your book,
yeah.
Highlighting your
Yes,
information.
but I mean, it was like, it took me forever to realize, hey, highlighter, and you could write in your book. I don't even know if we had highlighters at the time. But I mean, underlining in your book and writing in your book, I mean, that was such a no-no, because in school you did not write in that book or you got in trouble. So it took me a while to be able to do that, but I've been out of college for a really long time, and I only read for pleasure, leisure.
Are there any on there that you like know for a fact you don't do, or any that like you really do, and
Like
find
when I
really
was in college,
beneficial?
is that what you're talking about?
any? Just tell me
Anytime.
when you're talking about.
Okay, like before reading, sometimes I'll skim through the book. I don't write down questions. But during reading, say I'm reading to the kids, I stop after a section because with my pre-K, you about have to keep them interested. You have to stop and ask them questions, just like you said with the
Yeah.
vocabulary words. You know, because you read a big word and you keep going. If you don't explain that to them, they're not gonna know what it is, and that you get them that that interest, keep it going. And then after reading, I'm bad to not really do nothing with it.
You just
It's-
close the book
I
and
just
kind
close
of.
the
And
book.
under the
yeah.
during reading, I always do that. You know, if I'm confused about it, I'll always go back and reread something, try to figure it out, because I am diligent about that.
I know before reading, I do not ask questions, and I really don't review the purpose before I start reading. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if I have to read, it's because I have. You know, I don't think about the purpose, how it's going to benefit me. I'm reading something because I have to read it. During reading, I should stop after each section, and I probably wouldn't have to reread again if I would do that. But I don't stop after each section. And after reading, I do skim to find parts and I do take notes, but I don't really jot down the new vocabulary or discuss ideas or use a graphic organizer. Now with my students I do, but if it's something that I
Yeah.
do with just me and other adults, when I'm done reading, I'm like,
Well, and
all right,
one
guys,
of the
done.
big things that we have to do with Dibbles is when they get finished reading, after a minute, they have to tell us what they read about. So I have practiced that a lot with my kids about read this, flip it over, try to remember what you've read in order, so it's easier to get you, because sometimes they can read like 200 words a minute. You can ask what it was about, they can't tell you a single thing. So I would rather have somebody reading 60 words a minute and be able to give me a lot of detail.
Mhm.
You're coming out better in the long run.
Yep.
So that is when we do practice.
So mostly, you're saying like for yourself or like in college or now, if there's any mandatory reading, you don't always do all of them, but teaching wise, you
Yeah,
do most
yeah.
of
Yeah.
these.
And I think all that, the during reading section, has been really emphasized a whole lot in the last few years with
Yeah.
teaching.
I mean, I look at every
You
one
know.
of these things listed and we do. I mean, that's required.
Yeah,
for
it is,
math
and
law.
see, and really, and looking at each one of these things, as long as I've been teaching, we've went through every one of these periods at some point in time. Like, years ago, they really emphasized the before reading. Then we get on the kick of, so I mean, in education, every few many years, you're emphasizing each section
The
of
only
that more
thing
so
that
than
they
you are.
really emphasize now and before reading is to set a purpose.
Yeah, a
That's
purpose.
really they
And I
want you to
think that's
set
one
a
of the
purpose.
hardest things to figure
Yeah,
out is
yeah,
what is
why?
the purpose?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really all they
I mean, it's
emphasize on
evidently one of
before
those
reading.
brain roadblocks I have because the purpose of it is just not always clear to me.
I want to go back to my roadblock. That was number 5. It talked a lot about before you can change or before things can be changed. They have to really consider like the beliefs of the teachers and also like really work to provide support. Do you think, like you mentioned, years ago they focused on before, now they focus on during? Have they provided like adequate support in those changes, or it's almost just like?
I don't think, I mean, sporadically maybe. I think in education, things tend to go on whatever the big thing is at the moment nationally. And so it's just different times, different thing, I mean, we've went through the whole thing about reading a story. Looking at the cover of the book, you talk about the title, you talk about the author, you talk about the illustrator. You predict what you think it's going to be about.
Based on teachers
Based
first.
on the cover of the book, and then you
Yep.
flip through the book, and you talk about what you think's going to happen. So really, sometimes by the time you get to the actual story, you're already tired.
or they're done.
Well, they've lost their
Already.
interest, you
Yeah.
know, because research shows 10, 15 minutes.
Or they want you to do a brain break, and then when you get them back from your brain break, they're like, "Oh, what was the story about?" You
Yeah,
know?
I mean, it's,
So-
you know, just really everybody has to
You just gotta pick a
pick
couple
your own thing
that's
and, you know,
with your group of kids.
yeah,
that
and it
you
depends
know
on the group of kids
what
that you have.
what they need, you need to keep their interest,
Yeah.
you just gotta pick what works with them.
And that's what a good teacher does. You figure out what works with your kids and what they need. And, you know, we don't have as much leeway in this day and time to teach how we want to teach than rather how you have to teach and have everything scripted.
Well, I guess to finish off, I kind of want to know from the roadblocks, the strategies, and the checklist, what do you think, which one of the 3 that we went over today was kind of the most beneficial, like that you could probably use in your classroom? Or like not necessarily use, but maybe even just use the knowledge from us talking about it. We did the roadblocks 1 through 5. We all modeled strategies from the book, and we kind of discussed our checklist, what we do for ourselves and what we do with our students.
Well, personally, I think I could use more think alouds in my class. I think that
Yeah.
using a think aloud could possibly help students become better summarizers. I guess that's a word. Because if they really think about it and connect it to something that they can relate to, I think they'll be able to remember things better and be able to understand it and talk about it more. So,
And you cannot summarize what you don't understand.
yeah. So I think it's important that if we can talk about it and get them to understand it, they might become better at
And
summarizing.
then get them in the habit of things. I think that's one of the biggest things.
Like a,
And other roadblocks, I think we have to kind of stop the blame game. I mean, you know, middle school people with, oh, well, those elementary people didn't do anything because they can't read. And I think everybody needs to understand, okay, they have to learn to read before they can get to the content of reading. But you're going to have to figure out what your kids need and try to do that and, you know, bring other people in or resources if you need it. Because if they can't read and we don't do any, you know, repeating of a grade or anything, so more and more kids are going through with difficulty reading regular stuff. So then you put in science and social studies, it's probably like a major foreign language. So we need to try to, I think, work more together and try to figure out how to fix that gap.
Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.